I thought I'd get started by sharing the old screen, which looks like this. You made it here. You made it to the event. This is what we're doing together. And before we get going, I thought I would just make a quick announcement that this presentation is being recorded and it will be rebroadcast. I think it lets you know when you started, but I just want to make everyone aware so that if you would like to remain anonymous, you can. If that's the case, just raise that hand emoji so we can give you a minute to turn off your video or change your screen name or log off if you decide to do that. But I just want to make sure everyone's feeling comfortable here. All right. So let's get going. And if you have read the flyer, you've probably seen I'm here to talk about this new oversized hardcover art book I've got coming out. And needless to say, I am pretty darn excited about it. And if you've ever attended a KCU event of mine before, you know I like to start with a bit of an outline so you know what to expect over the course of the next 40 minutes or so. So I'll begin with a brief introduction to me, and I'll talk about the path that led me toward this most recent book I'm going to be chatting about. And then I'd like to tell you about the book itself. And after I do that, I'd really like to sort of pull back the curtain and maybe give you some helpful tips for, if you see this project and you think, man, I'd really like to create an art book of my own. These are some things I wish I knew at the start of this project that would have made my life so much easier. And once that's complete, then we'll open it up to some Q&A and just have some fun. So let's get started with that introduction to me. My name is Ryan Claytor. I'm a university professor and a comics artist. And I know that sounds, excuse me, like two pretty different things. So let's start with the first one. Here is some proof that I'm a university professor at Michigan State University, where I teach the comics studio courses. And I've also spearheaded the comic art and graphic novel minor course of study there, as well as a few other resources on campus for comics, like the Michigan State University Comics Forum, which is an event that's been running for 14 years at this point. And I'm really excited to celebrate our 15th year with a couple of keynote speakers. Keith Knight, who has done a ton of comics, but he's also recently written and produced a show on Hulu called Woke, which has run for a couple seasons at this point. And our second keynote speaker is going to be Rebecca Wanzo, who is a comic scholar and recently came out with a book called The Content of Our Caricature, African American Comic Art and Political Belonging, which was published by NYU Press. So that's coming up the first weekend of February in 2024. In addition to directing the Comics Forum, I've also hosted and produced the MSU Comics podcast for a number of years, and the archive of these shows is at msucomics.libsyn.com, where we have interviewed dozens of heavy-hitting, award-winning cartoonists and comic creators. I'm really proud of what we've put together with that. And another really fantastic resource we have at MSU is this unassuming glassed-in reading room for the Special Collections Library. And what you may not know is that below that floor, in the basement of the MSU main library, sits the largest public collection of comic books in the world, in the universe, anywhere ever, sits at Michigan State University. So we have, just the best conceivable resource for comics you could possibly imagine. If anybody ever comes to Michigan, please let me know. I'd love to show you the back stacks of Nirvana at some point. And but it's hard for me to mention this without also mentioning in the same breath this fellow, Randy Scott. Randy Scott was our comics bibliographer for 50 years of his life. He amassed this collection of over 350,000 entries. And he just retired last year, so he's enjoying a well-deserved retirement. And I'm also thankful to say that his position was filled by a fellow named Jason Larson, who has stepped into his very big shoes. So thank you to Randy Scott for creating this resource, which I often hang my hat on when I'm pointing to new comics things we should do around campus. Hey, we've got this world-class resource. So those are some MSU Comics resources and some hats that I wear as a university professor, but I'm also a comics artist in my own right. So way back in the summer of 2003, I interned at Marvel Comics in New York City, where I was a production intern and learned about industry technical standards, working in the bullpen, worked with the last in-house letterer because there's no in-house talent at any of the big two anymore. And I also filtered around to editorial, manufacturing, printed production meetings, and just have all kinds of stories to tell from that time. But for the sake of time, I'd like to move forward just a little bit to when I started self-publishing my own comics, which was shortly after interning at Marvel. So I created the moniker Elephant Eater Comics to self-publish my own work. And I understand that that is a weird name for a comic book company. So why that? It's actually based on a saying that my dad would tell my siblings and I growing up. I'm kid number 7 of 7. And he'd say, well, it's like eating an elephant. You just do it one bite at a time. And before you know it, you're done. So I always keep that mantra in my mind as I'm tackling big projects like making a new book or going through school. And it's really served me and my family well over the years. So speaking of comics, these are some of my very first comics that I ever produced. In fact, not only did I draw them, but I also printed them and folded them and stapled them all myself with the help of my very dear mother with the folding and stapling. And these were a series of autobiographical comics that I produced in runs from 200 copies to 800 copies a piece. And to my surprise, they sold out. And when they did, people were asking for more. So I compiled those into a collected version of the same comic strips. And from there, I continued producing books over the years. In fact, I've produced comics for about 20 years at this point. So I'm not going to go into each and every one of these, but suffice it to say, I've made some comics. I've also parlayed these skills of illustrating comics into client work, which I'll show you a couple of now. For example, this 30th anniversary logo that I was commissioned to do by the largest pinball manufacturer in the world, Stern Pinball. I've also had the good fortune of creating works for folks like NBA player Todd McCulloch, who hired me to do an illustration for his home arcade, as well as the largest pinball championships in the world. Yes, there is such a thing. So the Professional and Amateur Pinball Association, or PAPA, hired me to do their annual event artwork as well. I've also done crazy things like designing neon signs, which up until the recent past, I didn't even know was possible in this life, but I'm so glad that it's a part of my life now. I've done everything from home game room signs to exterior double-sided flag signs that hang outside of businesses and everything in between. It's just been a real blast to work in this medium. And I've also got to give a shout out to the neon fabricator that I work with, Josh Goodacre. He's been bending neon for over 30 years and is just an absolute master. And it's him who I have to thank for making these signs look like they did when they came out of my hand. It's just unbelievable. So I've also done some other design work, like designing watches for London-based company Mr. Jones Watches. In fact, this was the first watch I designed for them. You can see it's sort of a turn of the century carnival shooting gallery design, and the ducks on the top are the hours, whereas the targets on the bottom are the minutes. And when we released this broke their company sales records. In fact, it sold out worldwide in 2 hours. So when that happened, they basically said, "What do you wanna do next?" And I said, "Well, I really love pinball, so, how about a pinball-related design?" And came up with this, uh, pinball playing robot, scene where the back box scoreboard tells you the time. This is a jump hour movement, so the hour sits there for an hour until it clicks around to, 0 again, and then that hour jumps to the next number. So it looks like a score reel is kinda moving around there, and those robots are triple gilded in, gold, silver, and copper. So this watch also did really well and broke the previous company sales record, selling out in 30 minutes rather than a couple hours. And this design has now been reissued into their permanent collection and is now available. But I mentioned all that to sort of set the scene for what is to come with this art book. So foreshadowing, but I want to jump back into my work in comics. So one of my more recent publications is called Coin Op Carnival. This is an illustrated magazine that I co-wrote with my best bud, Nick Baldridge, who is just master of technology. So this publication would not be what it is without him. And then after we co-wrote this, I illustrated the entire thing. And it looks something like this, where we've got everything from interviews with the most prolific pinball designer of all time. His name is Wayne Nyans, to electromechanical game reviews and technical segments that help you diagnose problems in your machines. And out of this 64-page publication, I'd say about 20% of it is full-blown comics, like you see in the introduction here on the left, and the Wayne Leaves Western comic on the right-hand side. And after we released this, we were just over the moon to receive some really lovely recognition for it. We took home top prize in the Small Press and Alternative Comics Expo awards, getting first place for the graphic novel category, and also received a couple nods from some other industry awards, like the This Week in Pinball Awards. We were nominated for Best Pinball Publication that year, and also the Ringo Comic Industry Awards. We got nominated for Best Reality-Based Work. Now, after that, the next book I put out is called A Hunter's Tale, and this has really fond memories for me for many reasons, but one of them is that this was my first KCU presentation for A Hunter's Tale. So you may remember this from last year. So A Hunter's Tale was originally a poem about empathy that was written by my grandfather over 40 years ago at this point. And this is a picture of my grandfather and me that was taken, would have been just a couple years after he wrote that poem, actually. And I, over the course of the latter part of 2021, converted this poem into comics form. Looks something like this, and ran a crowdfunding campaign for it, which did extraordinarily well. This tiny little comic book about my grandfather's poem, 5-figure funded, and had literally hundreds and hundreds of people backing it. I printed 2,000 copies of this book thanks to that successful crowdfunding campaign. So I was not only able to fulfill those orders for the hundreds and hundreds of backers, but I also nationally distributed this book as well. So there's another many hundreds of copies out into the world. I mention all that to say, at the end of fulfilling all those orders and national distribution, I was spent. I was exhausted and was sort of looking around for uh, an artistic way to sort of recharge my batteries, which ironically led to my next book, which is called Mirror Drawings. So over the course of this like artistic rejuvenation I was making these little sketches in the corner of my sketchbook and mirroring them around a number of times and making these weird little drawings that looked like mandalas, or some of them were more figurative, or some were more experimental. It just depended upon the day. And I was sharing these with people in my life, close to me, also readers and patrons. And I kept getting people asking me, when's the book coming out? These are really cool. And honestly, that was the furthest thing from my mind when I started making these little drawings. But, when you start hearing people give you the same piece of feedback multiple times, usually it's time to start listening. So I did that. I compiled a book and released this thanks to another successful Kickstarter campaign at the tail end of last year. So that kind of leads us nicely into the path toward this new book I have coming out, One Bite at a Time, this art book featuring 20 years of my work. So I want to take it back to Coin Op Carnival for a second, because over the course of that year that we released Coin Op Carnival, Nick and I toured the country, letting people know about this new book we had coming out. We went to the West and hit California and Nevada. We were in the East in Virginia and Eastern Pennsylvania. We were in the South in Texas and the North in Michigan and Chicago. And we went everywhere two working dads possibly could, letting folks know about this book. And it was at the last stop of this tour. And I remember sitting there at Pinball Expo at the end of the year. And I don't know if this happens for you guys when you go to conventions, but inevitably there's a lull. And I remember sitting there and thinking, okay, man, this is pretty cool. We did this whole tour, and I've been doing this Elephant Eater Comics thing for a while. It's 2019 right now. And when did I start? Oh yeah, I think that was like 2004. So what does that mean? It's like 1, 2, carry the 3, 78, 1, 2, 15 years that I've been doing this thing. And I didn't even do anything this year to celebrate it. I couldn't believe that this was something that completely slipped my mind. So I vowed at that point to do something to celebrate this milestone for my next anniversary. And so here we are, approaching 2024, my 20th anniversary of making comics. So I bring up mirror drawings again to say this is another really important point in the path toward One Bite at a Time, this art book I'm telling you about, because before mirror drawings, I had never published a hardback book before. At the same time, I had One Bite at a Time, this art book on the horizon, and I knew it was coming, and I knew I wanted to make it big, oversized, and throw all the bells and whistles at it. But never having produced a hardback book, I thought, well, I should probably get some experience doing that first. And so I started conceiving of this book not as a paperback, but as a hardback book. And so I started doing what I do when I conceive of projects, which is making spreadsheets and figuring out how much things are going to cost and doing calculations to figure out how many people would need to buy into this project in order to make it viable. You'll also see things like if you rewind in the annals of Kids Comics Unite, I was posting and asking questions here and elsewhere around the internet to figure out, hey, does anybody know about affordable short run book printing for hardbacks? And so I was really in the information gathering stage at this point. But after having looked at a bunch of different printers, I decided to go with one in particular and managed to get a couple of books that that particular printer had produced. And this was a big learning lesson for me, to know that not all hardback books are produced the same. So on the left, we have Toddler Apocalypse that was edited by George O'Connor. And on the right, we have How to Think When You Draw with Lorenzo. That's like the best selling art book of all time. And the printer that I used printed both of these books. And I'm about to tell you some things about each of them that have to do with the binding, but this does not mean that I'm elevating or denigrating either one of them. These are just factual ways that books are put together. So if you look at that Toddler Apocalypse hardback book, I'm opening this to the maximum amount it can be opened. And it's hard to tell, but let me move this camera down just a little bit to show that about the height of my hand is where that cover stops. So we've got about, I don't know, what is that, 3 to 4 inches or so. before the book stops opening. And if I opened it any further, it would crack the spine and you couldn't lay it flat. Okay. The reason for this is because this hardback book was glue bound. So if you look very closely at the spine of this book, you'll see some glue slathered on those pages. Essentially, they're just a bunch of loose sheets of paper. They're not folded in half, they're individual sheets, and they're held together with glue. So that's glue binding. And not only can you not open up the book fully, but if you take a look at the book, there's a lot of the imagery that's sort of disappearing into the spine. Yes, you can account for that when you design the book and make sure that you pull that out of the spine an extra half inch or an inch or so. But all this to say, you lose some page when you're glue binding. Okay. Whereas a book that is bound with Smith sewn binding, so essentially they're sewing string into the book, this allows the book to lay flat. You see that this book is not being held open by me, by my hand. This is simply laying down on the ground. And the reason for that is this sewing method. So they call this Smith sewn binding. And prior to making mirror drawings, I was not fully aware of all this different binding techniques or what it meant. So I'm so glad that I decided to move forward with mirror drawings as my first hardback book, because this taught me a whole lot. So once I figured out that there's a difference between glue and Smith sewn binding, of course, there's a pricing difference. So that led me into more spreadsheets and more spreadsheets and more spreadsheets to figure out what I needed to do to make this happen. So there's a couple of learning lessons that I got before moving into this next hardback book that I am over the moon to tell you about. So this newest book of mine is called One Bite at a Time. It's an oversized 9 by 12 inch hardcover book documenting 20 years of my work in comics, illustration, and design. And I'm really excited about this for a couple reasons. One is the content of the book. And the other reason I'm super excited about this is for the formatting of the book. So maybe we can start with the content. So calling back to one of those books I mentioned before, A Hunter's Tale, this is going to be presented in this big art book of mine like this. This is the spread featuring A Hunter's Tale. And on the right, for each featured image, you'll see the artwork or the neon design or the illustration or what have you. But then on the left-hand side, you're going to see a little bit of didactic information, maybe a paragraph or two, but most of it is dedicated to process imagery, which is really important because process is the theme that runs throughout this book. When creating this book and sort of conceiving of it, I knew that I really loved understanding how people do what they do. And I wanted to reveal that for my process of making artwork, because I know that I always get inspiration from folks when I see how they did what they did. So you'll see on the left-hand side here, we've got like half a dozen thumbnail images for what the book cover might look like. And it progresses to the final pencils and the final inks, and eventually the printed book on the right-hand side. Now, if there are some folks who have seen A Hunter's Tale before and maybe even backed the Kickstarter campaign, you might recognize this image over here as the print for the Kickstarter campaign. However, the original intent for this illustration was maybe to be the cover. So this was the only book that I've ever taken 2 covers to complete fruition for. And this was because this project was so important to me and my family. So I shared each of these with my family and we had some discussions about it. And ultimately my dad, this was my paternal grandfather's work, said, I really love that black cover. It's really striking. I think that goes really well. So that was the winner. And this ended up being a print for the campaign. So you'll see comics like A Hunter's Tale and also Coin Op Carnival, where I'm pulling back the curtain to show things like the illustration process and even the final layouts on the page and what they look like. But I'm not just showcasing comic books in this art book. I'm also showing things like illustration design, and you'll see some inspirational books that I'll look through in order to get inspiration for some of my illustrations, as well as those neon signs that I've designed, like this Cthulhu-themed neon that I was hired to create. In fact, this sort of takes you through the process of my client work, where you can see the client is given a few different iterations on the left-hand side, and that sort of diagrammatically moves over to the selection that they made in a number of different color options. Then they'll choose a color option and we'll move forward to the final fabricated piece. So this happens for a number of different neon signs throughout the book as well. And I'm also trying to pace this art book in such a way where it's not uh, diagrammatic explanation after diagrammatic explanation. I'm also trying to give the reader a break as they move throughout to sort of enjoy some macro shots of some of these works that I've created. You know, the physicality of these works is really important to me. So that will happen a number of times throughout the book, and I'll show you some more of those too. I also mentioned my work for Mr. Jones Watches, designing watches, and you'll get to see things like the initial rough that I've never shown anybody before, not even Mr. Jones Watches, because when I made this, I had an idea of what I wanted, but when I looked at it, I thought, man, nobody's ever going to be able to understand what this even is. So I refined that sketch before handing it to them and proposing this watch. And then these are the final discs that create the watch and ultimately the colored and produced version. You'll even see things like photographic reference because I was having a real hard time drawing a foreshortened limb. And so I took a picture of myself in the same pose and used that to help me illustrate this. And the projects even go way back to my grad school days. Like I said, this is featuring 20 years of my work. So this is some really early stuff that I produced in grad school. This is an illustrated computer game, and you can see the run cycle for the Ryan Claytor character. This is me with a little more hair, like I said, 20 years ago. And he will run throughout this environment and interact with a number of different characters who all say mildly disparaging things about the medium of comics. And it's your job as the protagonist to either educate them or passively agree. And you are either rewarded or penalized based on your choice. So that was a grad school project that I completed. Has never been seen before, but will be printed in this book. Now, I mentioned I'm excited for this book for a couple reasons. One is the content, which I've been showing you a lot of, but the other reason is the formatting for the book. And there's a lot of specialty printing formatting throughout this book. Just for example, this is a page of original artwork from Coin Op Carnival, and this is going to be reprinted in the book at a really nice high resolution scan. And I'll zoom in here so you can see the original blue line pencils and the inks on top of that, the multiple ink strokes for highlighting Wayne himself. Even the texture of the page is here. So you can really sort of rejoice in the process of how this was created. But I mentioned all this to say, uh, I mentioned all this to say that when it's reprinted in the book, hey Ken, I think your mute might be off. Do you
Oh,
mind muting real
sorry.
quick? Thank you. So when this is reprinted in the book, it will not simply be printed on a page, but it's going to be paired with a page of final colored artwork. And when it is, there will be a few die cut holes in the original artwork, which will reveal that final colored piece behind it. So you can choose to look at the before or the original artwork, or the after the colored piece, or the before and after at the same time as you peer through these holes and they line up with the finished piece behind it. The same thing happens for the piece on the left-hand side. So this is just one of a number of specialty printing options that I'm including throughout the interior of the book, but then the exterior of the book has a lot of specialty stuff as well. Like, for example, the cover is going to be dual cloth bound. So this material, the brown and teal that you see here, is actual cloth. It's also going to have dual foil stamped images on the front, spine, and back cover. It's also going to have copper gilded page edges, built-in ribbon bookmarks, color matched head and tail bands, and the list goes on and on. But essentially, all this is available at the currently running Kickstarter campaign for one bite at a time. I'm trying to make it real easy for folks to get to this page with a custom URL that you can see at the bottom of your page here, onebiteatatimebook.com. That'll take you straight to the Kickstarter page for One Bite at a Time. And we've got about 16 days to go here. And I wanted to mention a couple of overlooked items. One, Patrick mentioned briefly at the start that this campaign is fully funded, which means you're not pledging for the hope of a project to be made. This project is going to be made. And that's thanks to many backers, many of which I see here today. So thank you so much for your support and helping to bring this project to life. So essentially, if you're not familiar with crowdfunding campaigns, stretch goals mean that everyone who pledges, either in the past or in the future on this month, they're all going to get a bunch more stuff, and we're going to make it even better for you to pledge toward this book. Finally, I wanted to mention another thing that often gets overlooked is that I've got a partnership with a reforestation organization called One Tree Planted, and it does not escape my notice that I am printing books that use trees, and I would like to offset that by donating back to this organization called One Tree Planted. And for every backer that backs this book, they are going to plant a tree. So I'm really excited to give back to the environment, not just take from it, and to sort of say thank you for growing this stuff that we use so often in our work. So that brings us to a few tips that I'd like to give for creating your own art book. And this is sort of like a mini lecture within this overall outline. So I'm going to gray this out for a little bit and toss this up top so we can start talking about these tips for creating your own art book. First of all, I would suggest committing to using a sketchbook for all your thumbnails. Now, I don't know about you guys, but prior to making this book, when I needed to thumbnail an image, I would reach to my left-hand side where I have a printer right in front of me, grab a piece of scratch paper, and sketch out my thumbnail image. When I was done with it, I would throw it in the trash because to me, it was garbage. It just looked like nothing. And I thought, I don't want this. Who else is going to want this? What use is this ever going to be? So that's where it went. However, that was not great when I was trying to compile a book of 20 years of my work that focused on process. So the latter few years of creating this book, I started using a sketchbook. And I've never been very successful at using sketchbooks in the past. And I think it's because I would get a sketchbook that is very pretty. And I think, oh gosh, I'm gonna, use this book all the time. I want it to look great. But ultimately, it was so pretty that I was afraid to put my garbage drawings in there. So I would just never use it. So I got this quasi-disposable sketchbook, this just, glorified paper folded in half, and started putting every single one of my thumbnail sketches in there. And that made it so much easier moving forward to have all that archived information in one place. So if I could give you a suggestion, it would be to develop a routine for where you are putting your preliminary work. Also, I would suggest making a periodic practice out of documenting your projects. So I showed you a number of these different pages, and every single one of those pages were a real puzzle to put together. They take time. And when you're doing that for 20 years worth of work, it takes a lot of time. Like I said, I've been cobbling this book together for the past 5 years, and I do not wish 5 years of work upon you. If I were to do this over again, I would treat this like my quarterly taxes. Every few months, come back to whatever you've done over that course of time. Maybe you've done some client projects. Maybe you've finished a book. Maybe you've made some artwork for yourself, and just take a day or 3 to go through and compile those into page spreads. then you're done until the next 3 months roll around. And that would make putting a book like this together so much easier. So making a periodic practice out of documenting your projects. Next, I would suggest releasing annual updates, which you can compile at a later date. So I kind of pulled a Craig Thompson on this book and like holed up for years and created a giant book and then released it all at once. And I don't think that's a very healthy or sustainable process. It's much more healthy and sustainable if you're releasing things periodically. And that gives you a sense of accomplishment like, hey, I did something. Also, it gives you some kudos from people who are interested in your work. And yeah, I'd like to get that from you. So that's a really great morale boost. It also gives you some additional sales. So you can make some additional money off this same project in a number of different ways, both in the serialized version and a giant compiled version later on. And finally, another reason why this is important is because some conventions, like Comic-Con International in San Diego, require annual proof of new work. But we all know that comics take a long time to produce, and sometimes we don't produce a book every single year. But if you're making that periodic practice out of documenting your projects and releasing them annually, then you're always going to have a publication that you can send to folks like that to prove that you're still making work. The next thing I'd like to mention is including permissions in your client contracts. So I showed you a number of different client work, commissions that I've had over the course of the years. And I am pretty proud of some of that stuff. Even though it wasn't personal work, I put a lot into it and I'm showcasing a bunch of it in this art book. However, because of that, I went back to every single client and said, hey, I'm producing this project. Would you mind if I reprinted it in this book? So essentially, I had to go get permissions for every piece that was in that book, which of course took a ton of time. So moving forward, I've incorporated permissions for this includes your use of it, but I also retain the rights to reproduce this in electronic or printed form in each one of my client contracts. So now moving forward, I don't have to go back and ask 20 years of clients if I can reprint this work that I made for them. And finally, remember to take some glamour shots of your work. I say this because, as an artist, I tend to sort of get down in the weeds and I want to do the work and keep making more. And when I'm done with one, then I'm on to the next. And I think that might be uh, similar for more artists than just me. So remember to take some time. And when that project is done, really try to document it in an interesting way, like taking interesting macro photography. Remember that neon sign I showed you? This is a big double page spread that's going to be featured in this art book so that folks can really take some time and rejoice in the physicality of this work. I also have another spread I'd like to show you that encourages you to get weird when you take these glamour shots. And what does that mean exactly? Well, one of the page spreads in this art book showcases a very large scale piece that I did back in 2007 when I was in grad school. And this is a large scale, 11 feet tall, 17 feet wide series of panels that was in my grad school thesis exhibition. And I really wanted to showcase this in a way that exemplified how big this piece was. At the time I was trying to think, well, how can comics occupy a fine art space? One is the content, of course, but as you're trying to occupy these spaces, a lot of times you'll see comics just like original artwork posted on the wall, and then you're supposed to like awkwardly stand there and read them, which is like the worst way to read a book, right? Like you don't stand up and stare at a wall to read a book. You want to sit down. And so I included things like, a table and there's a couch over here to the left-hand side so you can sit down and read them. But also, how can you make comics fit that environment? Another way is scale. So here I was trying to really fit the scale of the gallery, and included in this art book is this image. But I mention all this to say I had to get real weird in order to take some of these shots. I'm literally laying on the ground, hugging the wall, trying to get this interesting perspective of this piece so that I can showcase it at a later date. Thankfully, I did, because, 15 years later, here it comes in this book. Now, those are 5 tips for creating your own art book moving forward. And I wanted to give you one more sort of bonus tip here, and that's to use the material from your sketchbook, from these photographs that you're taking, from this documentation that's all working toward this art book. Use that in many different ways. You can use that on your Patreon. You can use that on your website. You can use that in a number of different places. So don't feel like you have to only use a thing once. You can get multiple uses out of your work. So that's all I've got for you in terms of tips, which brings us to the tail end of this presentation. So before I turn it loose to a question and answer period, I did just want to thank everybody for showing up here again. I really appreciate you being here and listening to me today. I also want to thank everybody in the audience who has already backed this book and is making it a reality, because this is my dream project. This is the most complex print publication I've designed in my entire career. And it is not lost on me that if you weren't a part of it, this wouldn't be happening, quite literally. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And once again, thank you to Jana for making this incredible community. I so appreciate you doing that and being here today. So thank you to everyone. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to give it a shot at answering them.
Pause for applause, right? I wish I had a soundboard here. Um, I've been tracking questions, so I have a few written down. I'll go a little bit out of order just to try and almost backwards first, and then I have a bunch of my own questions in case no one thought of anything, so I could grill you like with the spotlight and where were you on the date of. But I'll save that for last, right?
Awesome.
Um,
Yeah, Patrick,
so
I
so
thought you'd be such a perfect moderator for this because you are one of my patrons. So you've seen this project come to life over the past many months and years. So thank you for doing this today. I appreciate you doing this.
Oh, 100%. I mean, it's been an inspiration to watch this whole thing take shape and then to kind of make I have to admit I made a prediction that you'd be funded on the first day, which was wrong, but it was what, day 4? So
We
closer
made
to
it.
right than
That's the
wrong.
important thing. We made
Yeah,
it.
exactly, exactly. But so let me just tackle these questions so that we could just, really give the folks here some quality information, right? So one of them that stuck out was Kids Comics Unite, um, as a collective entity, right? Wants to know what gave you the idea for doing those cutouts and those, special features, which I was going to go into tangents on, but I'll wait.
Totally. Yeah. Well, each one is a little bit different. I did not show this, but I happen to have the one and only sample in the entire world right here. So let me show you something that is something I did not include in the presentation. But I, as an artist, have a really difficult time illustrating interlocking pieces. Like that just breaks my brain. And with that said, I've also drawn a number of pinball machines, and those are ripe with interlocking pieces. So on the left-hand side here, you see the finished colored piece, but on the left-hand side is the original artwork. And when I illustrated this original artwork, I was trying to figure out how to make all this fit together. And the only way I could wrap my brain around it was to illustrate the ramps on a sheet of tracing paper, which is going to be included in the book as a sheet of vellum, which overlays over top of the original artwork so that you can see most closely to reality how the original artwork was produced. So I really wanted to make this as authentic as possible. So that was like a big motivator for me for trying to find these different publication and printing techniques. But in terms of that die cut element that I showed you with the Wayne original artwork and the final colored piece that you can see behind it. As I mentioned, I'm an educator. I've also, spoken with my students a bunch about their interests. And when I mentioned this book I had coming out, they said, "Oh my gosh!" There's this one student in particular who said, "I collect art books. That's so exciting that you're doing one. Do you want to see some of mine? I have a whole library of it." I'm like, "Yes, yes, please bring it in. I'll bring in my own too, so we can swap and share and show each other." And one of the books that she brought in had a die cut element like that that showcased a penciled version overlaying an after version. And I just my mind exploded when I saw it. I'm like, I have to use that. So it's, being open and being available and sharing experiences with people like that and looking at other publications. We all get inspiration from different books that we see. And that was, a direct inspiration for me for that particular element.
Excellent. So Stephanie had to take a call, so she missed some of the details regarding the differences between the glue binding and the Smith sewn binding, which Roger was thinking might be also considered perfect bound. Right, perfect bound is the glue binding, if I recall correctly. But if you could just elaborate a little bit on, or return a little bit onto the difference, why you chose the Smith sewn binding over glue binding.
Is Smith sewn the
Sure.
same as saddle stitch also?
Uh, Not quite, because you're
Oh, man.
basically taking a number of different saddle stitched elements and stitching them together. So glue binding is when you have multiple sheets of individual pages, and if you can pretend there's a stack of them, we basically slather a bunch of glue on one end, and that's what's holding all these pages together. Whereas sewn binding, there are pages that are folded in half, and then they are physically stitched with string, and that holds them together to the next signature, which is a fancy word for a bunch of pages folded together. So signatures stitched to signatures allows them to unfold in a flat way. Whereas when you have them glue bound, they're kind of all held together with that glue and they can't quite lay flat. So I discovered that when I was marketing mirror drawings, because I was marketing that book as an interactive art book. I wanted people to use this thing and to be able to color in it. And if the book wouldn't lay flat, nobody was going to be able to color in this thing. So it was really important that I understood the difference between those two binding methods. Smith sewn binding is a lot more expensive than glue binding, which is why it's seldom used by self-publishers and low-run prints. But I priced it out and figured out what I'd need in order to produce that, and ran the Kickstarter accordingly and crossed my fingers real hard. To my surprise and thankfulness, enough folks backed it where I was able to produce that book and then some, meaning I originally proposed it as a 48-page book. It ended up being twice the number of pages, still Smith sewn, and a bunch of extras thrown on there. So anyway, back to Stephanie's question. I hope that demystifies the couple different hardback binding methods. And Roger, yeah, Smith sewn binding is sort of like saddle stitch, except if you can imagine the staples are made of string and connect each one of these additional saddle stitched elements together into a hardback book.
And if I recall my high school bookbinding class, the reason why it's called saddle stitch is because the saddle is like the triangle that you sit the paper on when you staple it, as opposed to the sewing machine. So that
Yes,
might be
that's
a
right.
factor.
That's right.
But Tanya, I hope I'm not mispronouncing your name, but she had a comment about how the theme of process, could that be considered a pushback against the surge of AI in the collective publishing space?
The AI
So
is a very recent event in all of our lives, right? And I was creating this book well before the AI event happened. That's not the right word, but I think you know what I'm talking about. So I was really interested in sharing a type of book that I would want to see in the world. I love it when I pick up art books and the artist will kind of pull back that curtain and show their process for how a piece came to be. And it feels much more approachable to me when I see just a beautiful image, sometimes I'm taken aback a little. Like I enjoy it, but then I start thinking, man, how did this happen? And I enjoy understanding that coming together of a piece of art. So that was really my motivation, not a pushback against AI. So I think this book was conceived a little before AI really got into the public consciousness.
Awesome. So Samantha has been really active with quite a few questions and comments, which has been awesome to see. But before I hand it over to her, I just wanted to follow up on Roger's quick question, which was who are you going with as a printer?
That's listed at the bottom of the Kickstarter page. If you hop over to onebiteatatimebook.com, scroll all the way down, I mentioned them at the bottom. It's a place called Rich Color Printing. I solicited quotes from over 24 printers for this book. Now, a piece of advice I always give to self-publishers is you want to solicit quotes from multiple printers, but usually that means like 3, 4, half a dozen or so should be plenty, and you'll kind of get a lay of the land. But this book was so specialized that I was not sure who would even be willing to print a book like this. So I narrowed it down to like a top 2 or 3 and solicited samples from each of them. And they sent me comparable books and also materials. I wanted that cloth bound cover, and they'd send me samples that were close to those colors that I was looking for. And there was just one printer that was head and shoulders above the rest, not only in terms of what they sent me. They didn't just send comparable books, but they sent not only samples of cloth and foil stamping, but here's a whole darn book full of foil stamping, so you can choose the exact color that you want. I would also chat with them periodically. Every month or two, I'd come up with some new cockamamie idea that I wanted to put into this book, and I'd say, can we do this? And they never told me no. They always said, yes, that is possible, and here's how much it'll cost, so that I could make the decision as to whether or not it was worth it. There were some other printers that I could tell, like, they just, like, it's sort of like dating. Sometimes you find somebody and they're like, yeah, that guy, I'm just not that into him. And I could tell these printers just weren't that into this project. So I went with the person who was very interested in this project and was willing to help me see this dream project to fruition. Yeah.
Awesome. So Samantha had some questions that ranged from, tips on how to fulfill. Because I know that you did your fulfillment yourself. So tips on like how to make that, not deadly, and then ranging to another form of like, how to start your own comics program at the university you work for, sort of thing. So but Samantha, feel free to unmute yourself and get specific with your questions.
Oh yeah, sorry, I'm enthusiastic.
Love it.
I guess the most relevant one would be the one asking about how you handled distribution and fulfilling orders on your own, because I'm thinking I'll have to do that, and I'm just wondering if there's a good way to streamline it.
Yes. So that's a great question. And if you're a first-time crowdfunder, I would recommend do not do add-ons. So maybe I can share my screen here real quick and just exemplify what add-ons are. So I'm going to hop over here real quick. And if we scroll down in the campaign to the add-on section, basically there's a number of rewards that you can choose from, but those are sort of limited. There's like, 4, 5, 7 different rewards. But if you want something specific, like maybe you don't just want a book, you want 2 books instead of 5 books, like at the retailer tier, you could get your book tier and then add on an additional book. Then you have a 2-book tier. That does not exist. Now, the reason I'm saying do not do add-ons is because it makes your life as a person who needs to fulfill this more complicated. Not only do I have add-ons for the existing material that's in this Kickstarter, but I've also been doing comics for 20 years. So I have a back catalog of work that I'm including too. So as a person who fulfills, in a perfect world, you have a very low number of possibilities for packages that you need to make. There's a package that is a single book, and that's it. So you can package them all up, and however many there are, they're all the same, and then you're done with that section. Then you move on to the next tier and package up all the books with the print and the patch or whatever it is that you're doing. So you package all those up, and then you're done. So streamlining your fulfillment process is super important the first time you start out. The only reason I'm not following my own advice is because I've done this a few times before. So with each subsequent launch, you can think about adding a level of difficulty or not. You don't have to. Think back to that last campaign and really try to think about, well, how did all that weigh on me? How did that weigh on my psyche? And was I stressed? Was my partner saying they needed to give me space or didn't want to be around me? Like, take all that into consideration before you start upping that level. And add-ons are definitely a way of upping that difficulty. They're also a way of upping the potential funding. I tried them out for the first time on my last campaign, and they added about 10% to the funding of my campaign. So I thought it was a reasonable thing to do for this. I managed it all right last time. So, tried it again this time. So that'd be my main recommendation. Keep your reward tiers concise and few. So that'll make your fulfillment process a whole lot easier moving forward.
Cool. Let's see. Oh, one of the other questions I had was because, like you said, with the way your students were saying, "Oh, we collect art books," I had a comment that I was the same way when I was younger. Do you have any plans to contact university bookstores to see if they would want to carry it? I know that there's a directory list somewhere of every university related bookstore in the country.
Wow, that's amazing information that I did not know about. So maybe we can get in touch afterwards and
Yeah, I'll
share
dig it
some
up.
info. I'd love that. Yeah, thank you.
And then, oh, the last one I had was I'm just really impressed by this minor program in comics and graphic novels. I don't understand how it happened. The university I went to was still super snobby, like, "Oh, we're fine artists here." Like, how did you have feedback from academics? How did you deal with that? Or do you?
Oh, Lord, yes. So this was okay. Uh, I'm gonna spin you the yarn. It's not short. I'll try to make it a little more concise, but here's sort of the Cliff Notes journey of how this came to be. I was originally born and lived and raised in California and was teaching at a number of different institutions in California. One of which I came this close to teaching a comics class. I went through all the necessary steps to create a syllabi and propose it and get it approved. And it was on the books the next semester. And then I met my then girlfriend, now wife, who got a job across the country. And we moved to Michigan together after knowing one another for months. And so we went out to Michigan. She got the job at Michigan State University, and she tried to get me a partner hire while she was at it. They said, "Are you married?" We said, "No." We very recently met. And they said, "Oh, well, then we'll give him one class for one semester, and that's it." Like, that was my sweet deal for moving across the country. But I wasn't about to leave my partner. So off we went. And when I sat down in front of the department chair and they said, "What do you want to teach?" I handed them one singular class. I said, "Here's the comics class that I would like to teach." And I had taught a bunch of other stuff before, like graphic design programs, Photoshop, Illustrator, web tools, Dreamweaver when that was a thing. I'm dating myself. But I said, "This is the one I want to teach." And they said, "Okay, go do that." And I did. And it over enrolled. And it's been offered every semester since. So the first step was getting a foot in the door. But in terms of creating a minor course of study, I was really lucky in that I was able to leverage the world's best resource of comics. The first thing I did when I got to Michigan was go visit Randy Scott. I referenced that collection when I was writing my master's thesis and was so excited to be there. So I introduced myself to him, and it was very apparent that he was really keeping his head down and had done so for many years, because almost nobody knew about it. He didn't want to make waves about it. He's like, yeah, I'm just going to keep cataloging my stuff here. And I told him right then, I said, I'm going to make it my job to blow this secret out of the water, because everybody should know about this, because when they do, the upper administration is not going to be able to say no to this thing existing. And that's what we want. We want longevity here. So over the course of making that comics podcast, every single episode has Randy on that podcast talking about a different selection from the Special Collections Library. We could have done selections to the end of time and not covered everything in that collection. But anyway, all that to say, we really started making a big deal out of the collection. And that's what I started pointing to when I wanted to do more stuff. I wanted a more permanent position. And so I said, look, we've got this world-class resource. Let's make some more comics classes. So they allowed me another class. We made an advanced comics class. Said, look, this is going really well. Let's make a minor course of study. Managed to get that through all the flaming hoops of the university. And now that's on the books. I was also trying to make myself indispensable those first few years, because, you know, I was lowest person on the totem pole. And as an adjunct faculty member, if folks aren't aware, there's sort of this really unhealthy hierarchical system in the university setting where there's tenured positions and there's adjunct faculty positions. Tenured have, security. Adjunct faculty do not. And as an adjunct faculty, I was trying to make myself indispensable. So I was creating a new podcast. I was stepping up as the director of this annual event. I was making new classes. I was making minor courses of study. And so there's 15 years compressed into a few minutes. And that's kind of how what exists at MSU in terms of comic studies came to be. Now, I did not create the collection itself. That was Randy Scott, but that is what helped me grow what's at Michigan State University right now. Does that answer your question? All right.
Awesome. So I just want to take this time to open up the floor to anyone who's suddenly thought of questions over the course of this conversation, because I still have about this much I want to get through. But before I dominate the time, because I could just call up Ryan and ask him directly. And Ryan, I just tipped my hand, right? Because now you're going to be worried that I might just randomly be calling you, but I won't. Promise.
I welcome the call, Patrick. You know I love chatting with you and hanging out.
Yeah, but the time difference.
It's true.
Right?
It's true. We can navigate 3 hours. We've done it before.
Right. Yes, exactly. So anyone else have any questions they want to just unmute themselves and voice right now before I start in the interrogation process?
So I'm going to quickly jump into chat, which I very rarely do. I see that Jana asked a question and she says, are you still adjunct, or did they finally give you a tenure position? I am not a tenured faculty. I am still adjunct. I have worked myself into, it's sort of like tenure light for the adjunct stream, and it's called designation B status. It's supposed to give you more security. It puts you on a multi-year rolling contract, which means it used to be 3, it's now 5. So basically, every year you teach, in theory, you're 5 years out from being fired. And then each subsequent year, that rolls forward. But ultimately, I know if poop hits the fan, I'm going before the tenured folks are. So, it's the best I've been able to cobble together as a comics professor. There's not a lot of us around, and I'm really thankful that I get to work with students and help them realize their dream of making comics. And in doing so, it, gives me inspiration and furthers my knowledge and cements this stuff in my mind so that it becomes like more innate as I'm creating comic. It's pretty darn great. It's not totally sunshine and rainbows, but it's pretty darn great. And I'm thankful to be here.
So translation is start trouble only on the second year of that contract, and then 3 years to make up for it. Is that
No, it was about 15 years of haranguing.
okay?
Every year I'd say, hey, how about a second class? And then once I'd get it, I'd have something else that I wanted to build on top of. Hey, how about a minor course of study? Hey, how about a podcast? Hey, how about an annual event? Hey, how about something else? And so there was always the most recent thing was, hey, how about I only teach comics classes? And that was my most recent haranguing. And the past 2 or 3 years, I've taught exclusively comics courses at MSU. So that feels really good.
Yeah, so it's always advanced. There's this, here, Kung Fu tangent. Always advancing, right? That's a principle. But okay, Kung Fu tangent over. I want to really kind of jump into the whole thing because I know like there's about 5 people here who have done crowdfunding on one level or another. But 20 years of indie publishing. So I was wondering if you could just briefly break out like what, because okay, perfect example, right now, just the other day you did an in-person event on Saturday, right? So like in-person events are kind of coming back to the crowdfunding ethos, right? Post-pandemic, etc. But I remember a bunch of years ago it was much more common than it's been until just recently. So that's one example off the top of my head. But can you kind of help folks navigate this new concept of indie and self-publishing that they might be considering for the first time?
Sure. So narrow that question a little for me. Are you asking like how does one
I want your
organizing an
opinion on.
in-store signing, or am
Well,
I missing the question?
I kind of Frankenstein 2 questions together, right? So one question is, how do you see indie publishing changing most recently? Looking at your 20 years of doing it, what's been the past 3-4 years been like? So that's one question. And then the other question we can come back to, which
Okay.
is like promoting books, etc.
Sure. How is indie publishing changing? And I'm so glad that you're here, Jana, because if there's an alternate opinion that you have, I would love to hear it. But in my estimation, from my viewpoint, indie publishing is really gaining a huge head of steam right now. And I think Kickstarter is a big element that's helping to bolster that. So back in my day, when I first started making comics, Kickstarter did not exist. They came around in 2012. They've been here for, a little over 10 years at this point. And even when they started, they were not something that was incredibly helpful because they were new too. And it was new to everybody. And fast forward to now, and at the very least, people have at least heard of crowdfunding. And if they've heard of crowdfunding, they've heard of Kickstarter. So the stigma is quite a bit less now than it was back in 2012. But back in 2004, when I started making my first comics, I was literally walking them around to individual comic book stores, asking them to take them on consignment in hopes that one day I might see a little bit of money from them. Fast forward to now, and I have students who have run a Kickstarter campaign, and they've got over $1,000, over $2,500 for their first comic book. If you told me that in 2004, I would have thought you were nuts, but it's a reality right now. So I think indie publishing is surging. I think there's a lot more resources for us as independent publishers, self-publishers now than there used to be when I started. And I am so thankful for it, because after harnessing an audience for 20 years, I've amassed an email list of about 1,500 folks at this point, who enjoy what I do, thankfully, and are there for a project that I put out. And to the point where this book is going to become a reality. Like, I love books. I love books as art. And I love it when artists and designers will take into account the physicality of the book form and make it relate to the content of the book too. And if you look over the course of my 20 years in making comics, you can kind of see that is present, but to a much lower degree, because I just didn't have the resources to do it. But now this book is like, I'm throwing everything in the kitchen sink at this. There was not a single thing that I wanted to do that I could not, because of audience growth. I've managed to find a core group of people that enjoy what I do. Very thankful for that. Also because of resources. Without Kickstarter and crowdfunding, I could not have made an ask that big. Go look at my funding goal, and it was the biggest ask I've ever made of my entire career. And I was nervous going into this. I didn't know how this would go. I'm asking for almost 5-figure funding to start off. I've never done that before, but thankfully it is reality. So what does independent publishing look like now and moving into the future? I think it's in a better place than it ever has been. I think the stigmas towards self-publishing are starting to come down a little bit. You used to sort of get a side eye when you said that you were a self-publisher, and I think it's far less now than it used to be. And if I can just take this moment to encourage everyone, and I feel a little strange saying this with Jana in the room, but you do not need to be vetted in order to be validated. You do not need anyone's permission to make work. If you have a unique voice that you want to share with people, you can do that. You don't need anyone's permission to do that. And by permission, I mean, you don't need to go to a big pub in order to make that happen. There are a lot of ways that we, as weird, independent, oddly minded people, can share our unique view with the world. And that's what I want to see. I want to see people who are making weird stuff, who are making like off the beaten path type stuff. Like, that's the kind of work that I like to see from people, and that I want to share with folks in the world too. So you can do it. You don't need permission.
Awesome. Well, Stephanie has her hand raised, and she's also just recently launched Janice Point Press. So I'm sure there's going to be some exciting questions in the immediate moment.
Thanks, Patrick. So I'm totally going to take my answer video off because I got to pick up my kids in 10 minutes. I'm totally listening to you as I multitask. So I just have to start. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation again. Love print, love die cut, love details, love art books. You got a radio voice, you got everything going on great. So just really great presentation. And now I forgot my question. My question was this. So I'm totally feeling everything you said with indie publishing. I'm wondering your feelings though with current trends in crowdfunding, and in recognizing what you said, with the exception of creators like yourself that have a fan base, I believe, a big fan base and a platform, professor, all the great, wonderful, and sincerity, right? I think this is a very big key ingredient in what you're doing. But I'm also seeing and then hearing veteran Kickstarter creators, there's, been a little bit of a downtick in, particularly around comics, things being funded. And I've personally noticed a lot of Kickstarter campaigns that I think should have done better. They barely got funded, but they got funded, or they're not being funded. And yes, I do notice that the woman with the nacho cheese on her booty and FSW or whatever that hashtag is, those comics are kind of like, yeah, they're selling. There's more of that, or they're more selling. So just if you wanted to elaborate a little bit on that very valid. And I feel that discussion on the strength of indie publishing, and as someone that had past agents to agents, you could do it yourself. Of course, when you meet a wonderful agent like Jana, you know, you can get fireworks too. So yeah, just your thoughts if you've noticed, you know, what you feel, particularly with the collapse of social media and Twitter. I know that's hurting a lot of us. So I'm totally listening to you, but I got to pick up my kids and get ready. So I'm going to listen to you, but video off. Thank you.
You got it. Thank you, Stephanie, for the great question. And as a fellow parent, I totally understand. So turn that video off, go get your kid. And we're recording, and I'll put this up somewhere after the fact so you can listen later if you need to. But with that said, so essentially, you were wondering about a potential downturn in current crowdfunding trends. And I feel very lucky in that I've been able to fully fund this big ask of a project. And I don't know what other crowdfunders are doing. I don't have a look into their promotional calendar. I don't have a look into who they're contacting or what's happening exactly. But I do know what I'm doing. And in addition to yelling it from the rooftops of every social media platform that I'm on, which, you know, has a variety of returns, I honestly don't know how much good that does, aside from putting it in front of people's faces multiple times over, which, as we all know from marketing, is a key. People need to see it umpteen times before they act on a purchase. So there's one thing that happens from social media. But I'm also personally and individually reaching out to people and saying, hey, Patrick, I don't know if you knew this, but this book I've been working on for 20 years is coming out, and I'm so excited about it. I just launched a crowdfunding campaign for it, and it's at this easy to remember URL. I'd be grateful if you took a look at it. And I'm contacting lots of people in my life, not only friends, family, but also I've mentioned it in my class a time or two, not to sell it, but because my students are also interested in crowdfunding. And if they want to take a look at, hey, here's a campaign that's trying to make it happen, there's an example. I'm also letting, you know, coworkers know, or just anybody I can think about in my life, I'm contacting in some way, shape, or form. That could be via individual Facebook messages. It could be via text messages. It could be via email. It could be what have you. And I'm individually reaching out to people in addition to the mass market, social media, mass emailings, etc. And I think as a consequence of that, I'm seeing folks come to this campaign. And I have a feeling that maybe that's not part of everyone's marketing campaign. I think we see social media as this save all, like, oh, I'm doing something, hey, everybody. But we all know that those feeds are, nobody sees everything you make. So I'm literally posting on social media every single day. Every morning I get on the treadmill, and that's what I'm doing for the 45 minutes or hour that I'm walking around. And it's not something that is, you know, that I wish was a necessity, but it's part of what I do. So that then when I'm in some time where I can have a little more headspace, then I'm crafting more personalized contacts to people. So I would say that's what I'm doing. I don't know what other people are doing or what is helpful for them, but I've found that's what's helpful for me.
Thanks so much.
You got it, Stephanie. Thanks for the question.
Awesome. Shall I continue? Anyone else have questions? Because I've still got plenty. Tebby, please go right ahead.
Yeah, I just have a quick question because I'm just so early in the process and I have nothing. So I think I asked you a little bit about the newsletter, and you said to build basically sort of a collection of people so that I can email directly to what out of curiosity, just what kind of content do you put in them, you know, just to keep people interested? Because I think I've done so much creative work as a graphic designer that I don't even know where to start to send stuff, you know, because I don't know, where do you start?
Yeah, that's a great question. What do you put in your emails when you send it out to people? It's so personalized. People gave you their email address to start with because they like you or they like your work. So they want to know what you're doing. And if you're working toward a project, I'd say first and foremost, bring them along on that ride. What is it that you're making? Are you making a comic? Are you making an art book? Are you making a piece of graphic design or what have you? Whatever it is, pull back the curtain, show some of that work. Like, here's a recently finished page, or here's a page that I was really struggling with and I threw 5 sheets of paper in the garbage, and here's a crumpled image of what they look like and showing why you moved away from that and what you ultimately arrived at. And then you can also include things like things that are inspiring you. Like, what's something that you saw recently that you thought, oh man, this is really amazing, or I want to incorporate this in my work somehow, or just gives you some good feels and you want to share that with people. So I try personally, and again, this email stuff is very personalized. So take this with a grain of salt and make all this what you want it to be. But for my emails, I try to keep it somewhat pointed, like 3 main things I want people to take away. I'm working on this project. I have a sale on my website, and I found this 3-story automaton that's walking around the streets of New York City video that's operated by 20 different people. Look how cool this is. So like a few bullet points and then head out, and I'll do my best, not always successful, but I'll do my best to keep it as succinct and pointed as possible, because we're all so gosh darn busy and nobody has time to read through a dissertation. So I try to keep it pretty picture heavy, pretty text light, and pretty like entertaining. Like, here's a thing that I did. I'd love to share it with you. Here's a thing that inspires me. I hope this provides you some joy, that type of stuff.
And how often do you send out your newsletter?
That's also super personalized. If you're asking me personally, I started sending out quarterly email updates. When the pandemic hit, I felt an urge to connect with people on a greater frequency and felt like I wanted to talk to people more often. And so I upped my frequency to every other month. I am in a situation where I do not have enough content to share much more than that, because I'm a teacher. What am I going to do? Show them my lesson plan? Like, nobody wants to see that. So like about every other month, I feel like I can cobble together some points of interest and share that with my readers and bring them along on whatever ride I'm taking at the moment, toward a hunter's tale, toward mirror drawings, toward One Bite at a Time, toward whatever book I'm working on, because I've always got some project that I'm working toward. And so I'm trying to share that with them. But personally, I send out every other month, and that's what works for me. But if weekly works for you, great. If quarterly works for you, great. You know, I just know myself, and I know I can't keep up with a weekly email update. I know folks that do, but I'm not one of them.
That's a lot. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you got it.
I still got more questions. So anyone else? Shall I continue? Well, because this is an interesting thing, right? Like what you commented about the newsletter, right? While you're doing your newsletter every other month, thereabouts, you're still hitting these like amazingly, like I can set my clock to it, your updates on Patreon, right? So there's still like a system that you've got, like a calendar that just like has something go, you know, to hit your Patreon, and then eventually it hits your newsletter, and then it hits your social media. And that's the impression that I've gotten observing your work. Is it accurate? Did I just make that up?
No, you've got it just about right. So as Patrick alluded to, I have a Patreon account and I update twice weekly there. On Fridays, I will update with whatever art practice is happening for me over the course of the week. And just like I talked about in the newsletter, I also provide some inspiration, something that was inspiring me over the course of the week. I'll see a book in a bookstore, or I'll see a video online, or I'll, find something that gets me excited about the world and share it with them. So that happens weekly. And as Patrick also said, it happens like clockwork because I have a list of Patreon posts that I, take an hour or two. I say, okay, next week it's posting then, and then I have the next one and the next one, and I have them all lined up so that I don't even have to create the post. The post is there, it's titled, it's time to go out on subsequent weeks, and all I have to do is populate it with what I'm doing. So over the course of the week, as I'm creating something, I'll try to remember, oh, I'm making art and now I'm sharing it with people. So I'll take a picture of like what I'm doing or part of the process and put that on the Patreon post and share it with my patrons. I'm trying to get better about remembering, oh yeah, this process you're going through can be interesting. How are you going to document that? And that's the weekly Patreon post that I'll do. I have 2 weekly Patreon posts. One's on Friday. That's the sort of what am I doing post. And then on every Tuesday, I also have a post that just doesn't quite fit into that weekly update. Sometimes it'll be like 5 frequently shared tips that I'll give my comic students, tips for beginning comic creators that I give out all the time. Or maybe it'll be like a process video, or when I'm not making comics or watches or neon signs or fancy pancakes, I'm cross-stitching. And so every once in a while, I'll make an update of like time-lapse video of how my cross-stitching is coming along. Like that's a weird thing I'll post on Tuesday. So basically, if it doesn't fall into the what am I doing this week Friday post, I also have a whatever Tuesday post where I can post other stuff that I want to share with people. So Patrick, you said, how does this all fit together? Basically, every day I'll just toss a picture up on my already created weekly post, and I'll cobble together as much as I can before the end of the week and then share it with folks every Friday. I have an every other month email newsletter, and in recent years, it's sort of been a best of Patreon. Like I'll look back over the past couple months and, oh, I thought that image was really interesting, or this particular piece of process got some really great response. Let's share that with a wider audience, to my email audience. And so sort of repurposing content in multiple different places. So yeah, that's sort of my strategy currently, and it doesn't always happen like clockwork, but I have made Patreon a big priority in my artistic career these past 2 years. I started doing it a little more than 2 years ago now. And when I started doing it, I subscribed to Patreon creators to sort of get a feel of what was there. What are people doing? What do I like as a subscriber? And what I enjoyed was knowing that I'm going to get some content from them. Sometimes people would create a Patreon and they wouldn't update for a couple months, and oh, I forgot, here's a bunch of stuff, and then disappear again. And I like understanding what they're doing. Like I like that process stuff. So I thought, well, I'll provide that for what I'm doing. And it's been working out all right. I've seen like a slow, steady growth over the course of the past couple of years. It's not lighten up my bank account or anything, but I really enjoy sharing the process and having that interaction with folks who are probably the most invested in what I'm doing.
You just read that last line off the top of my head. I was just thinking that thing about investment, but I'm gonna have to write down that bit about having all of the posts prefabricated and then fill them in as time goes on, because
Yep.
that's something I need to learn. But Jeff Larkin comes in and wants details. He wants percentages on how much time you're spending on each one of these endeavors. So let's get the numbers down. I've got my calculator right here.
Yeah, Jeff, did you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, I want hard numbers. Come on, percentages. Like,
So as a creator, I view my output as like seasonal. Like there'll be a season of creation, and I'm really like hunkered down and making the thing. Then the thing comes to fruition, and it's time to shout it from the rooftops. And then I'm heavily in promotional mode, which is what's happening this month. Okay. I can't step on the treadmill without making a social media post. I can't let a day go by without letting people know about this. I can't let an evening go by without messaging 5 more people in my life that this thing exists. It's just, that is my season I'm in right now. After that heavily promotional season, I'm very tired. And I have a period where I'm not doing much of anything. I'm not making that book. I'm not promoting it. I've got projects backed up in the back of my mind, and I'm just doing any wacky thing, like making mirror drawings that I didn't think was going to be a book. It was just some weird thing to get my hand moving, like, you know, coming up with new cross stitch things, like book binding, like whatever flight of fancy that I have. I'm like, okay, whew, I'm done with that. I'm recharging my batteries now. And I'm just doing whatever the heck I want and not answering to anybody for a while. Then by the time my batteries are recharged again, I'll typically get a project back from the printer, and then I'm in fulfillment mode, packing and boxing and sending stuff out. Like, oh my God, grandma got this, mom got this, my friend got this, somebody I don't know got this. Oh my God. And I'm literally touching every single book and sending it out to whoever backed this project. And that is in and of itself its own high. Like, I hear a lot of people complaining about fulfillment, and I understand it's not the thing you want to do forever, but there's a real like sense of gratitude that I have in going through those names and understanding each individual person that helped bring this project to life, because I could not make this project without every single one of them. So I really enjoy that. And then you've probably seen some of my pictures of like overloading my mail person with packages when it's all said and done. And like that's a real sense of accomplishment to be able to send all those out, and a real sense of celebration a few days later when everybody gets it at the same time. So I know that there are folks who like trickle it out, like I'll do 5 packages and send those out, and again the following day, which is totally valid. But I really like having this like party atmosphere, this celebration of like, oh my God, we're all getting it at the same time. It's like a book release instead of this slow trickle. Like some people have it, others don't. There's hurt feelings sometimes. I don't want that either. So for me, I try to cram all that fulfillment into a very condensed period and then release it all at the same time so we can all celebrate together. And then by that time, I'm like itching to get back to that next project. So then I'm back to that first season, creation, marketing, licking my wounds, fulfillment, back to creation again. So
that makes total sense. And thank you because I wasn't sure whether people are actually trying to do all things at the same time, but this seasonal approach makes sense. You've obviously done this a whole bunch, so you remember how to ride the bike. But do you ever find yourself coming back to that season and like, oh, there's a little bit of rust on my tool now that I got to knock off?
Definitely. Yes. So when I come back to like creation mode, I'm still, after 20 years, like is anything going to come out of here? Like, is this still working? Because I've been like packing or marketing or whatever for the past umpteen months, and I still get nervous about like, am I going to make anything decent? Like, I still have those the words are eluding me. I'm sorry. Those self concerns about what's going to come out, if anything. But I always come back to that mantra that's been so important to my family. Just doing it a little bit at a time, just one bite at a time, doing it a little bit each day. And if you can get your butt in a seat for 15 minutes a day, and even if garbage comes out one day, it's gonna be more polished the next day, and you're gonna remember how to ride that bicycle. And you know, that's a pep talk I need to give myself seasonally also. So yeah, I feel you on that.
Cool. Thank you so much.
You got it.
Yeah.
So we could safely say 33%, 33%, 33%, and then just leave it at that, right?
It's so clean, Patrick. No.
Awesome. Well, I mean, I could still ask you questions about hand lettering and product photography, but we are at the 11:40 mark. I just want to take the temperature of the room in terms of like, you know, like I said, I've cleared my whole day, Ryan, so I could hang out here until the battery on this laptop goes out.
I can hang out until I need to pick up my son in 20 minutes. So I've got until 3 o'clock Eastern time. So another 20 minutes here. I'm still good if anybody has any more questions.
All right, anyone? Tevi, please.
Just,
And let me know, am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Yeah, it's
Okay.
Tevi. It's very easy.
All right.
I don't know if you know the answer to this question, but I'm just curious for international publication because you're self-publishing, so it's domestic market. Are you getting it into the international market? And do you go through like Ingram Spark, for example, to do that?
So I am sort of straddling a couple markets as of recent campaigns with A Hunter's Tale and now One Bite at a Time. I have crowdfunded that, which is one means of distribution. And at the same time, I'm also getting national distribution in Diamond Comics, which distributes not only to the United States, but also North America and the UK. So I've been able to get into multiple markets that way. I have not gone through Ingram Sparks. I have not done Amazon. There are a few blind spots on my self-publishing radar. So I don't have a complete and total answer to that, but through national distribution, I've also managed international distribution.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if anybody else would know anything about that. If you do, please throw it out there into the mix. I'm just curious, when you do self-publishing and you want to reach the international market, how that would work and how would the translation and all that stuff would work.
Yeah, I think as a self-publisher, you could probably hire a translator if you wanted to, if
Yeah.
the market is there and if you think you're going to see that return. I don't have ties to different language speaking countries. So for me, I've sort of focused on English language. It's not to say that I don't want my publications to be translated. I've reached out to a few international publishers to see if that's something that they might be interested in. Up until this point, I've had small books like saddle stitch books mainly. And they've said, you know, we need something with a spine in order to really take a good look at this. So if you're looking toward an international market, you might think about creating a larger work. However, from what you've said this session already, it sounds like you're sort of just starting in your career. If I were you, I would start focusing on small projects first. Get those small wins under your belt, and then eventually you can take those and compile them into something larger, and then take that compiled version and then market it overseas if that's something that's a goal for you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One quick comment I just want to make while we have it. Make sure to hit the little meatball menu at the bottom of the chat and save a copy of the chat, because there's so many good links that have just been like trickling through the conversation. So for
Awesome.
you, Ryan, but really for all of us, we should take a copy of it, because there's so much good information that I've been noticing. So
That's a great suggestion. Thanks, Patrick.
for sure. I mean, so much good info on this thing. But yeah, do you want to tackle lettering, or do you want to tackle product photography?
You steer the conversation. What would you like to know about, Patrick?
Well, okay. So lettering, right? Lettering is a topic amongst all of us comic creators to one degree or another, right? Some people are like on the mission to find the perfect typeface. Others want to have their handwriting converted into a digital font. Other people want to master the dying art of hand lettering. So that said, I know you've dabbled in a variety of those, if not all three. I can't verify that for sure until right this second. So yeah. So where do you stand on that spectrum?
All right, lettering. Let's talk. So I personally, in my comics, hand letter, but sort of cheat. And by that, I mean, I mentioned having taught lots of different things over the course of my career in education in the university environment. I mentioned that to say I've taught Photoshop, I've taught Illustrator, I've taught different graphic design programs. And so those are like extensions of my body. I feel like I cannot work without them. And that's to say I have a very convoluted working method. I will start laying out a page of comics in Adobe Illustrator because I can bring in gutters and cut them up with slices, and that's really quick and easy for me. I will also digitally letter while I'm there in Illustrator and set up all the speech balloons. But then I do not want that like perfectly rectilinear, even line work. I want something with like a little more wobble and wiggle and character in it so that you can see the person's hand behind it. But at the same time, I want something like sort of meticulous and like well-centered and appropriately spaced and all that. So I'll take that Illustrator document with panel borders and speech balloons and print that out in blue line on a piece of Bristol on top fed printer. Okay. So I have this like junky all-in-one, printer, scanner, fax, copy, whatever machine. It does all of those things in a very mediocre way, but I don't need it to do any of those things in a very fantastic way. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because you can get these things for pretty cheap, like under a couple $100, and you're in for one of these oversized printers, which is really important for printing blue line on Bristol. So I'll jam a piece of Bristol through there and it prints out my Illustrator blue lines. And then I can hand ink over top of that for the panel borders and the lettering, which is what you were alluding to. So now my lettering has this like idiosyncratic wobble and feel to it. And it looks hand illustrated, which it is, but it's also got this foundation, which is very precise. So that's how I letter my comic books. It's not to say it's the only way. There's a million different ways to approach lettering of your books. And then in terms of like cover design, for my next book, this is almost all text on the cover of this, right? If you look closely, there's a few nods to the different things going on inside the book, like comics and stitching and fancy pancakes and watches and all sorts of other stuff, but it's mainly text. But I really enjoy when people will pay attention to typography. I took a lot of inspiration for that cover from a lettering artist named Jessica Hish. She put out a book called In Progress, I think it is, In Process or In Progress. I think it was In Progress. And she's got this just immaculate design sense and a really takes her time with sort of puzzle piecing together these letter forms. And so that was something that inspired me. I also like looking way back into like turn of the century advertising. And back then it wasn't just like cursor plunk, type something out, buy this thing. It was like beautiful artistry trying to sell you whatever they were selling at the time. And so I'll look back at typography then because it was a real art form and appreciated, 100 years ago, whereas today it's not quite the same. So I guess those are a couple of different approaches I have toward lettering. When I'm talking about stuff like my book cover, I cannot tell you the number of times I went in and out and back in and back out of digital and analog spaces when I was trying to puzzle piece this thing together. I think it fits pretty okay now, but it was really a big process of like, okay, I'm sketching this out. All right, I think I can piece this together in Illustrator. All right, let's print it out and ink it. All right, that's not quite what I want. I'm going to take it back in and rip it apart digitally. Okay, now I'm printing it back out and re-inking it. And that was not the end of the process. Like it kept on from there because I really wanted a striking image for the cover of this that people could get interested in, because I knew this was going to be like my magnum opus. So I really spent some time on that. Does that answer your lettering question, Patrick?
Oh, 100%. I mean, also because like I've seen you do the hand lettering on some of your like logo design work, and it's not, I mean, I don't know if you do it for like, work for hire clients, but it seems to me that that handcrafted aesthetic is part of your brand, I should say, and so it carries over in the comics, but also in your logo design or other design work, it seems.
Yeah, I do both. It sort of depends on the job or the client, but you're right. For my work, I like people to be able to see a hand behind the work, that it's not perfectly laid out in digital. And, I like there to be like some hand-drawn elements there. But I've also worked with clients who want that vectorized logo, and I make that for them as well. I'm really comfortable in Illustrator. I love vector art, and so I enjoy getting in there and minutely altering letter forms. But then at the same time, I also enjoy using that program to inform what I do in a hand-drawn way, both in terms of logo design or comic book lettering or what have you.
Yeah, well, don't get me started on learning how to set type on an actual letter set machine, while riding on the back of a dinosaur. But so yeah, so process, right? Like I've also noticed your product photography, and I think that's something that a lot of us, 2D creators, book creators, kind of overlook, right? Because like I've been accused of it too. Where I'm like, I've got the digital version of my comic cover, and then when I get the printed version, I just slap it onto the scanner and I scan that, and that's going to be what I use, right? But you take it a step farther with your little, white space, infinite horizon box. So I know Jeff has done photography in the past, but maybe we should just touch on the value of like getting good shots of your work.
Yeah, that's something that's become a big part of this next project, because for most feature images, if there's a physical product to be had, I'm showcasing that in a physical way the best I can. So thankfully, most of the products that I make are pretty reasonably sized. They're books. And I say that because I've essentially created my own light box. I've been doing self-publishing for 20 years, and that means that I've been being scrappy and cheap for a really long time. So I might be able to go out and buy my own light box at this point, but I saw this tutorial on YouTube and I'm like, yeah, I could do that. And essentially this was during the pandemic. We're all getting stuff in cardboard all the time. And I took one of the larger boxes and cut a hole in each of the sides and also on top, covered it with some like fusible webbing. It's basically like sort of a gauzy type fabric. And that allows for a diffusion of light so that when you shine up a light inside from the sides and the top, you're not just getting a hard light with hard shadows, you're getting a nice soft light with soft shadows around it, and it looks like it's in a more professional environment. I'm also, throughout my life, whatever situation I was in, whether I'm a struggling student in school or in a more comfortable spot in my life, I'm using the best camera that I have available to me. And thankfully for this book, I was able to purchase a real nice camera, and that's helped get some nice product photography too, in addition to creating that setting with a light box I was telling you about, and having some Photoshop skills, because I have never taken a photograph that was perfect. I'm always taking it into Photoshop afterward and either lightening that background to showcase the product, or doing something to make it look a little bit better. So those are some of the steps that I'll use. Lightbox, the best camera I have available to me, and then Photoshopery is kind of how I look at product photography. But I am by no means a professional photographer.
Well, I tell you, it's a total inspiration to see the images as they're meant to appear in your book, but then also to see, thanks to Patreon, right, to see them in the box on the floor. Like it's not like a freaking prestigious studio where you're hiring a professional photographer. It's you on your knees, doing the work. And so I think that's just, to tie in the whole process conversation that we've been having, just to see that bit of extra effort is an inspiration.
Thank you. Yeah, it's so messy behind the scenes. I mean, you get to see it. You get to see this like cardboard box that looks like garbage propped up on top of a table of some sort, and that's what I'm using. But then I show you the pictures afterward too, and it looks like museum catalog type shots, right? It's like, it turns out okay, but the behind the scenes is not pretty. So you do not have to have a professional studio in order to make this happen.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so we are a couple of minutes out from closing. So I thought I would tee you up for a final humble brag about the particular technological accomplishment reflected in your Kickstarter page, i.e. the headers and the header graphics, which, you made Kickstarter change how they do things
I did
to
not make
accommodate
them
your
change
aesthetic.
that. Okay, I think we might need a screen share here. So real quick, back over to the Kickstarter page, Patrick is talking about these header images that are basically part of a table of contents for this page. So if you do not want to scroll through this entire campaign, because it gets kind of unwieldy, you can think, oh, just take me to the rewards and click, and it will do that. Or take me to those add-ons, and it'll do that. Well, Kickstarter rolled out some functionality here recently where they allowed you to create header text. And when you assign text as a header, it automatically creates this table of contents for you, which is super handy because these Kickstarter story pages get big and overwhelming. I thought that was super great, but not only me, but a number of other folks were saying, man, I use these header images to make my campaign branded in a particular way, but we can't use them as headers. So I reached out to the folks that I knew at Kickstarter and said, hey, I'm not the only one. There's some folks who have this suggestion. Is there any chance that we can allow headers, images to act as headers too? And to make a long story short, Kickstarter developers reached out to me and they said, we're really interested in your idea. Would you like to meet like via Zoom at some point? So we did that following week and I had this great conversation with them. They were so receptive and just, you could tell that their hearts are in the right place, that they're doing this for the right reasons. They want this to be good for the creators. And so it was shortly after that that they contacted me and said, hey, would you like to beta test this thing that you were suggesting? Of course, yes, please. And so they allowed me access. I tested it out, and not only did it function perfectly, but it was so easy to figure out that I didn't even need to look at the instructions that they sent me. It was just intuitive. And I sent them back, glowing praise and said, I've got this integrated on my soon to launch page already. And I didn't even have to read your instructions because it was designed so well that I could just make it work. It was that easy. And, it was really great because they sent me back some feedback from some of the developers, and they're like, we've never received feedback like this before. Like, who talks to people who are coding behind the scenes and say, good job? So it's nice to like spread that appreciation to folks that don't hear it too. But anyway, I was lucky enough to be in a position to beta test this thing, and now it's in full functionality on Kickstarter, and you can use that to create those table of contents with images, not just text. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, I wish that they had that like a month ago, because it's like you have to choose one or the other. So,
Totally. Yeah.
Way to voice that. I was like, oh no, which one do I do? And I ended up going with the having the catalog or the appendix, whatever it is, table of contents. So
yeah, I think that's really important for making those Kickstarter pages manageable. I would have done the same thing. Yeah.
Well, this has been fantastic. We are at it's only 12 noon. So you said 3, right? We have plenty of time.
Depending upon where in the country, yes.
Yeah.
But I do need to go pick up my son.
Excellent. Well, I mean, if everyone, our tradition here at KCU is that we unmute and we all say thank you and goodbye and cheer, etc. So thank you, Ryan. This has been
That was
great, Ryan.
awesome.
This was absolutely fantastic. Thank
Totally
you.
awesome, Ryan. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for sticking
Informative.
around
Thank you.
for
Amazing.
2 hours. Oh my gosh, thank you for hanging out with me all this time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, this was a great time. We'll get a replay out there at some point. Ryan, I'll be in touch, but I'll let you go for now.
All right, sounds great. Take care, everybody.
All right.
Bye,
Take care,
everybody.
all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.